Good afternoon. I want to get started with our screencasts for this afternoon with a kind of finishing out of the visual design and layout for websites presentation that we were working through on Monday. And what we got to in our presentation was about the point where we started talking about colors for web, and then at that point it got really hurried. So what I really want to make sure we realize is that there are different ways that we can generate colors for website use. And the presentation includes a couple of links for reference charts and a converter. And those links are embedded in the presentation, but they're also actually available through our D2L course portal. So I want to make sure you know where to find them. If you log yourself into D2L and you look at resources, content, that's where we get all the content stuff for the class, you'll find in there presentations, and this visual design for web presentation is posted as well as the previous presentations that we were using. Under online resources, that's where we're actually going to find these color resources for websites. There's 3 actual links provided. The first link is a color tutorial by W3 Schools, and it essentially just kind of lets us take a quick look at how does color work for the web, provides some good examples of RGB colors and hexadecimal colors with explanations of how they get used and how you can create them. So that's really good for just general sorts of information about how colors get used on the web. The color converter is another little resource that will let you put in color values for a color that you happen to be interested in. Maybe you have a CMYK value that's 10% cyan, 30% magenta, 0% yellow, and 10% black, and that's just what you think would be like the perfect color value for use in your ORCID's website. So you could type in the CMYK values and it will provide probably most usefully the hexadecimal value, because that's the one that we're really going to be using whenever we're creating our website. So I want to make sure we realize that we do have access and links to those resources through D2L. Okay, back to our presentation. The other thing that we looked at was this color chart, just to kind of help us get a visual of what's good and appropriate color for the web. And it relates to the idea of hue, the color name, the saturation, kind of like the intensity level of the color, as well as the brightness, how light or dark the color is. And brightness tends to be a big factor whenever we're viewing websites on screen or media on screen. So that's what this relative brightness kind of little diagram, or I guess graph, was about, showing us visually which colors best contrast with black and which colors actually happen to have pretty poor contrast with black, dark blues and reds. Okay, that was our little visual note. What I'm recommending that you do whenever you start to develop your visual ideas, those sketches of what you want your website to look like, you're going to need a consistent color scheme, which you're going to have to plan in advance. So that's going to be helpful to have that as part of your plan, especially when you start wireframing and eventually coding out your website. My whole usual kind of talk about using color in design is that less is more. Have like a defined, meaningful, purposeful color scheme and then use it consistently. And one of the things that we mentioned really briefly at the end of our last class meeting was this interactive color scheme tool. So I made sure I put a link to it. It's this Peloton Color Scheme Designer. And I just want to click right in there. And I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about this tool and some of the ways that we can use it. the idea is that we would select a color. Okay, so I'm going to select a color, and again, I'm thinking orchids here. So I'm thinking something that might be very orchid friendly or orchid-like for my website. So I'm going to select my color. When I select my color, it starts to show me over here, like kind of like a preview of a color scheme. And the initial color scheme is monochromatic, and these little kind of dials up here allow me to select different sort of pre-programmed color schemes. Monochromatic, adjacent, which picks two colors that are sort of in line, a line in a row on the color wheel. It allows me to pick a triad of colors, some colors that are across the color wheel, and it also will select for me a triad of colors. Any of these can be configured to add a complementary color. The complementary color is the one that's across the color wheel, tends to have a high degree of contrast. So we see this and we see these little color blocks on the right. I don't think that's the part that's terribly exciting. What is terribly exciting to me is that underneath this kind of predetermined color scheme over here, I can actually look at examples. So I can click in and say, hey, that's what that color scheme could look like if I applied it to a website. So maybe not monochromatic, kind of might be like, I'm not sure that's going to work for me, but I could see an example of what that could look like if I were to apply one of those triad color schemes with a complementary or an adjacent color scheme with a complementary color, looking at something of, hey, what would that triad kind of color scheme look like? And again, this is not intended for you to copy exactly. It's intended for you to use as sort of a visual tool, kind of like, how do I really want to apply my color scheme in my final version? So it's really just a tool. Again, a really awesome part of this tool is that it's always going to be giving you the colors and their hexadecimal values, which is just incredibly helpful to us because we know that that's one of the things that we're going to have to really control whenever we start coding our CSS. Okay, so you do have access to all of those color resources through the D2L portal. All right, so enough about talking about color. Let's talk about the other pretty important design characteristic that we need to control, and that's typography. And one of the things that people usually notice when they start looking to set a typeface for the web is the disappointing selection of typefaces. You're like, I know I have 100 typefaces on this computer. Why are you talking to me about these 6? Arial, Verdana, Tahoma, Georgia Courier, and everyone's favorite Times New Roman. Well, the reason that we have so few type choices on the web is because web page fonts get installed on the device of the viewer. So we're kind of choosing these default fonts that are likely to be installed on everyone's mobile or on a tablet or on everybody's laptop or desktop. These are the fonts that are typically available. So we tend to limit our choice so that when the browser goes out and it views the web page, it can just pick from fonts that are already installed on your device. We don't have to waste time downloading other font definitions, or worse yet, having a font selected that you don't have and then it just does some garbled weirdness on the screen instead of being this legible font that you planned to use. The other thing that you are really likely to notice, and we noticed it on Monday, or excuse me, last Wednesday and on Monday when we were working with defining CSS, is this concept of font families. You're going to be like, I go to pick a font and it wants to give me a family. And these families of fonts, and this is an example of one in the presentation, Baskerville, Palatino Linotype, Palatino Century Schoolbook, Times New Roman, Serif. They have similar font characteristics. And what happens is your browser will look for the first one first. Hey, does this device have Baskerville? if there's no Baskerville, it'll be like, does the device have Palatino linotype? Wait, we don't have that? Oh, okay, good. It has regular Palatino. I'll just use that one. So it's sort of like a preferred presentation kind of list, like, hey, I'd like to use this one, but if it's not available. And if you get all the way to the end of that and you're like, I can't find any of these fonts, it will just display in something that uses a serif. So, you know, that's kind of the idea behind the font family. It groups them into those families with similar shared characteristics so that you'll get something that looks acceptable when it displays in the browser. The other topic I want to make sure we address is the idea of font sizes. When we coded our CSS the other day, we were using relative sizes. There's a lot of different choices when you get into font size. The kind of preferred ones are relative sizes. You can also use pixels. Points is a possibility. That's not for websites. Websites don't really use points well or effectively. If you watched any of the CSS video tutorials that were provided, the designer that was coding the CSS was using EMS. That's kind of a current trend. It's not really necessary to use EMS. My suggestion is that for this original website, basic website that we're creating, that we use either pixels or relative sizes. So I do want to pop into Dreamweaver for just a quick second because I want to take a little look at what this looks like in our CSS designer. And I just popped up on my screen that little simple CSS web page we were building the other day, and I clicked into one of our selectors. And I want to start first with the idea of using the font properties for that and these font families. So we see that we have these kind of default pre-formed, pre-made font families. I'm going to ask that when you develop your design for this basic website that you simply stick with one of these predefined font families. As we progress, we'll get more information about how to better manage fonts and about how to use web fonts eventually. But there's enough choices here that we can create a basic website using the font families. The other characteristic that I really wanted to look at was font size. And remember, we used this selection of relative font sizes. And what that means is it's just going to make extra small will be smaller than small, which is, smaller than extra large. So I'm going to suggest using the relative font sizes or choosing pixels, which is all the way up at the top there. Sorry, I don't think that actually made it on my screen because my preview software doesn't show my entire screen. So let me click back into font sizes. There we go. Either selecting pixels or choosing a relative size. Okay. And again, one of those is going to be sort of the simplest and most intuitive for you to control when you're doing your coding for this basic website. Okay, that's all I really have to say about visual design for websites. You kind of have a solid idea of a plan, of a plan of attack, I guess, of what you need to do to get your website created. I also sent out a link already, a Dropbox link that contains all of the images and the text file for the ORCID's website. So I'm hoping that you will be able to work through your planning process effectively. And bye for now.